Subscribe and tell us where you're watching us from. Jonah Alexander Maxwell, a lonely millionaire, had been away for 2 long years. He had chosen to isolate himself on his luxury yacht, sailing the vast seas and avoiding everything that reminded him of the life he used to have. His life, once full of joy, success, and love, had crumbled after a devastating betrayal. Now, as he finally returned home to Malibu, the sky above was painted in beautiful shades of amber and rose as the sun began to set. His black Rolls-Royce Ghost rolled smoothly through the iron gates of his grand estate, the only place that truly belonged to him anymore. The house, a massive mansion, stood before him, still as magnificent as ever, but now it seemed more like a reminder of everything he had lost. It felt strange to be back. His fingers tightened around the leather steering wheel of the car as he felt the familiar yet suffocating weight of the driveway beneath him. It was a welcome sight, but one that made him feel trapped in memories he couldn't escape. His knuckles turned white from the tension, and a bitter, ironic chuckle escaped his lips. "Home sweet home," he muttered, the words dripping with irony. 2 years ago, he had walked through those very doors, and everything in his world had been perfect. His marriage to Vera, his business success, and his friendships were all intact. But that had changed when he walked into his office one fateful day and caught his wife, Vera, in a passionate embrace with his best friend and business partner, Elliot. His whole world had fallen apart in an instant. The betrayal hit him hard, and it left him emotionally broken. Jonah had retreated from the world, spending 2 years sailing from one port to another, nursing his wounds and trying to forget the hurt. Now, at 34 years old, he had returned a different man. The pain had not completely healed, but he had learned to live with it. He had come back to rebuild, to reclaim control of the empire he had built, and to regain some sense of peace. The mansion he had once shared with Vera now stood empty, the place where everything had changed. Jonah's jaw tightened as he glanced at the house. It was still beautiful, still his, but it didn't feel the same anymore. As he walked up to the door, the security system recognized his fingerprint with a soft beep. The familiar sound brought a small sense of comfort, but it wasn't enough to erase the tension that still lingered in his chest. He pushed the door open and stepped into the marble foyer, his Italian leather shoes echoing on the polished floor. The house smelled different now, not like it used to. The air was filled with a subtle blend of vanilla and jasmine, and it wasn't a scent he recognized. Something had changed. Jonah's eyes narrowed as he scanned the room, looking for any signs of change. The house appeared immaculate, just as he expected. His personal assistant, Zane Clark, had been in charge of managing everything while he was away, and she had done so flawlessly for the past 5 years. Jonah had always trusted Zane completely. She had been there for him during the darkest moments of his life, handling the media storms, the business meetings, and even the messy divorce with grace and professionalism. She was the one person who had not betrayed him, the only one who had remained loyal. Despite the way he felt about his past, Zane was always in his thoughts. Even now, thinking about her brought a warmth to his chest, one he quickly pushed away. He couldn't afford to let emotions cloud his judgment. Zane had always kept her distance, maintained her professionalism, but in the years they had worked together, she had become more than just an assistant to him. She was the one person he could always rely on, and that made the thought of her both comforting and unsettling. Jonah loosened his tie as he climbed the curved staircase, the weight of exhaustion settling over his broad shoulders. 2 years of running from his past had not erased the memory of that day, the day he had found Vera and Elliot together. The pain still felt fresh, and his heart ached as he walked toward the master suite. The door was slightly ajar, which was odd because the house should have been empty. He paused for a moment, listening to the faint sound of steady breathing. His muscles tensed as instinct kicked in. He pushed the door open cautiously, and what he saw inside stopped him dead in his tracks. There in his bed lay Zane Clark, fast asleep. Her long, straight hair was spread across his pillows like dark silk. She was still wearing a black dress, the kind she always wore to work. One hand rested near her face, her features softened in sleep, and all her usual guardedness was stripped away. For a moment, Jonah stood frozen, unable to process what he was seeing. Zane had always been beautiful, but seeing her here in his bed, in such a vulnerable state, stirred something inside him, something dangerous. He cleared his throat, trying to shake the unexpected emotions that had risen in him. "Miss Clark," he called out, his voice rougher than he intended. Zane's eyes flew open immediately, her honey-brown eyes locking with his stormy gray ones. She bolted upright, her usual calm and composed demeanor shattered. "Mr. Maxwell," she gasped, scrambling to her feet and smoothing her dress with trembling hands. "I didn't expect you back so soon." Jonah's tone was cool, but beneath it, there was a storm of emotions. "Care to explain why you're sleeping in my bed?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. Zane quickly gathered her composure, her spine straightening as she explained. "There was an issue with my apartment building," she said, her voice steady despite the awkward situation. "A pipe burst, and the repairs are taking longer than expected, with the housing market in Malibu being what it is." She paused, lifting her chin. "I made a judgment call. The house was empty, and I needed a safe place to stay temporarily." Jonah studied her, his blue-gray eyes never leaving her face. He noticed the slight flush on her cheeks, but Zane held herself with the same quiet dignity she always had. She had never overstepped her boundaries before, always maintaining a professional distance, but now, in his private space, things were different. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. 3 weeks, Zane replied. She met his gaze without flinching. "I've been looking for a new place, but with my schedule and all the work I've been doing for you—" She trailed off, her voice growing quieter. Jonah ran a hand through his dark hair in frustration. "You could have called me," he said, his tone softer now. Zane looked down, her hands still smoothing the edges of her dress. "I didn't want to disturb you," she said quietly. "I knew you needed time to heal." Jonah leaned against the door frame, his imposing figure blocking the exit. The room felt smaller now, filled with an unspoken tension. The soft scent of jasmine, mixed with his own cologne, lingered in the air, and it made Zane's pulse quicken. He sighed and ran a hand over his face, feeling a mix of frustration and concern. "Take the guest suite in the East Wing," he said finally, his voice firm. "It's yours for as long as you need it." Zane's eyes widened in surprise. "Mr. Maxwell, I couldn't possibly—" "It's part of your compensation package," he interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You've more than earned it, Miss Clark." She gathered her things quickly and moved past him, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. As she passed, her arm brushed against his chest, sending an electric shock through both of them. Neither of them acknowledged it, but both felt it. At the door, Zane paused and turned to him. "Welcome home, Mr. Maxwell," she said, her voice soft and professional. Jonah watched her disappear down the hallway, her head held high as always, her movements graceful and measured. But once she was gone, he sank onto the edge of the bed, loosening his tie completely. The bed still held the warmth of her presence, and her jasmine scent lingered in the air. He had come back to rebuild his life, to take control of everything again. But now he found himself facing a new challenge. Zane Clark, the one person he trusted above all others, had become something more in his mind, something he wasn't ready to face. In the East Wing, Zane stood by her window, gazing at the city lights. Her heart was racing as she replayed the events of the night in her mind. Jonah's shock, his cool but commanding presence, and his words, it all haunted her. She had built her career on being invisible, on keeping a distance from everyone, especially her boss. But now, living under the same roof, everything had changed. The balance they had maintained for 5 years was gone, and neither of them knew how to move forward. The next morning, as dawn crept over the Malibu coastline, Zane stood in the mansion's kitchen, holding a mug of steaming Ethiopian coffee. She hadn't slept much. Her mind kept returning to the night before, to the way Jonah had looked at her, and the way his presence had made her feel. It was dangerous, and she knew it. She couldn't let it happen again. Jonah walked into the kitchen, fresh from his workout. His gray tank top clung to his muscled frame, and a light sheen of sweat glistened on his skin. Their eyes met across the kitchen island, and the air between them grew thick with unspoken tension. "Good morning, Mr. Maxwell," Zane said, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. Jonah accepted the coffee she offered and took a sip. "Call me Jonah," he said, his voice soft but firm. Zane stepped back, trying to maintain her distance. "It wouldn't be appropriate, sir," she replied, her voice steady. Jonah set his coffee down with deliberate care. "What's not appropriate is maintaining such formality when we're living in the same house." He took another step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "Next time you're in my bed, it won't be by accident." Zane's breath caught in her throat, but she kept her composure. "This is dangerous territory," she warned, trying to keep her voice steady. Jonah looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of frustration and longing. But before either of them could say anything more, the sharp ring of his phone interrupted them. It was Vera. Jonah's expression turned cold as he answered. Zane stepped back, her professional walls slamming back into place. She quickly left the kitchen, her heels clicking on the marble floor. What was happening between her and Jonah had to remain a secret. She couldn't afford to let it change her career or her life. But as she walked away, the memory of his words lingered in her mind, making it impossible to focus on anything else. Back in his office, Jonah found himself distracted by the scent of jasmine that lingered in the air, a reminder of Zane's presence. Zane moved around the office quickly, putting papers in order and adjusting her tie. She looked calm and professional, but she noticed that her hands shook a little, and she couldn't look him in the eye. She had a lot on her mind this morning. Zane started to talk about the Morrison contract, but Jonah interrupted her smoothly, saying, "Mr. Rodriguez was waiting in the conference room." As she turned to leave, Jonah grabbed her wrist gently, feeling her pulse race beneath his touch. "We can't ignore this forever," he said softly. Zane pulled her wrist away, saying, "There's nothing to talk about," and walked away. The day passed with lots of meetings and phone calls. Both of them tried to stay focused on work, but couldn't stop thinking about each other. There was something between them that couldn't be ignored. That evening, Zane sat alone in her temporary apartment, looking at apartments online, but couldn't concentrate. The sound of Jonah's footsteps in the hall made her freeze. She hoped he would stop, but the footsteps passed by. Zane wasn't sure if she felt relieved or disappointed. In his office, Jonah poured himself a drink, trying to forget the stress. His ex-wife had called that morning, reminding him of why he kept his walls up. She was moving back to Los Angeles with their son, Elliot. Jonah hated thinking about it. The last thing he needed was complications, especially not with Zane. She wasn't just his assistant. She was the one person he trusted completely. But lately, things were changing. He couldn't ignore the way he felt about her. The night went by, and both Jonah and Zane lay awake, thinking about each other, knowing tomorrow would bring another day of pretending everything was normal. How much longer could they keep denying their feelings? The next morning, Jonah stood at the golf course, trying to clear his mind. His friend Reed noticed something was off. Your swing is off," Reed said, watching Jonah miss a shot. "You've never been this distracted before." Jonah just adjusted his watch and didn't want to talk about it. Reed pushed a little more, suggesting that maybe it had something to do with Zane living with him. "It's temporary," Jonah said quickly, trying to avoid the topic. "Like hell it is," Reed replied. Zane is different from the usual women who chase after you. She's smart, loyal, and capable. You care about her. Jonah didn't respond, focusing on his golf shot. He didn't want to think about it. Meanwhile, Zane sat in a cafe with her best friend, Molly, who was giving her a hard time. So, you're living with Jonah Maxwell, the man you've secretly loved for 5 years, and nothing's happened? Molly raised her eyebrows. Zane quickly looked around, telling Molly to lower her voice. I'm not in love with him, Zane said. I just respect him. Molly wasn't convinced. Respect doesn't make you memorize his coffee order or organize his closet, Molly said. When was the last time you did something for yourself? Zane thought about it and remembered how she'd always put Jonah first, even canceling dates for him. She felt a little guilty. I'm looking at apartments today, Zane said, clearly trying to change the subject. But Molly wasn't done. Running away won't solve anything. Maybe it's time to take a risk. Just then, Zane's phone buzzed. It was a message from Jonah saying there was an emergency meeting. Duty calls, Zane said, gathering her things. At work, Zane walked into the office, and it was chaos. Jonah was standing in front of the windows, tense and upset. What's wrong? She asked. Vera and Elliot are trying to take control of the Morrison deal, Jonah explained. Zane thought quickly. The Morrison deal was worth billions, and she had helped Jonah with it for months. They can't do that, she said. But Jonah explained they found a loophole in the contract, one that was left open during his divorce settlement. They're claiming the idea came from a conversation we had 2 years ago, Jonah said. Zane worked quickly to gather the right documents to fight back, her fingers flying over the keyboard. We can fight this, and she said, I have everything we need. Jonah stood close behind her, watching her work. She could feel his warmth, and it made her heart race. I kept all the records so they couldn't hurt you again, she said, but Jonah's voice softened. I wanted to make sure you never got hurt. Before she could respond, he was standing very close to her, and his voice was low. Look at me, he said. Zane turned slowly, and his face was right in front of hers. His eyes looked at her with so much intensity that it took her breath away. Why? He asked. Because you deserve better, she whispered. Before they could say anything more, his phone rang. We need to focus, Zane said quickly, standing up. I'll gather the legal team. But Jonah grabbed her arm, stopping her. This conversation isn't over, he said. Zane gently pulled her arm away. We can't afford distractions right now. She walked away, trying to focus on work. The day was full of meetings, phone calls, and plans. Zane worked hard, and by evening, they had a solid plan to stop Vera and Elliot. After everyone left, Jonah watched Zane gather her things. Have dinner with me, he said suddenly. Zane froze. Mr. Maxwell, not as your boss, she said. Jonah moved closer. As a man who's tired of pretending he doesn't see you. Zane's heart was racing. We can't, she said. Why not? Jonah asked, stepping even closer. Because I don't want to be just another woman in your bed, Zane said, her voice sharp. And because your ex-wife is trying to ruin your life again, and I won't be a distraction. Jonah's face changed, and he stepped even closer, gently touching her cheek. Is that what you think this is? He asked softly. Zane's heart raced, but she quickly stepped away. We can't do this, she said, grabbing her things. I'll have the legal briefs on your desk tomorrow. She hurried out of the room, her heart still pounding, her skin still tingling from his touch. Molly's words kept echoing in Zane's mind. Maybe it's time to take a risk. But as Zane drove back to the big house, back to the dangerous place where she lived with a man who was starting to see her as more than just his assistant, she wondered if some risks were just too big. She had built strong walls around her heart for 5 years. Could she really let them come down now, especially when everything she worked for was at risk? The answer waited in the dark, as complicated and uncertain as the feelings in her heart. Thunder rumbled across the Malibu sky as Zane paced around her room. The rain hit the windows hard, matching the storm in her mind. She kept thinking about the almost kiss in the conference room. Her laptop was on the bed with apartment listings, but Zane wasn't thinking about moving. She couldn't calm down. Her phone beeped with a new message from a number she didn't know, and it made her shiver. The message said, "I know you're living with Jonah. Stay in your lane, little girl. You're not the first to think you can climb the social ladder through his bed." Zane set the phone down. Of course, Vera would find out. She had spies all around the rich people in Malibu. The threat was clear, but it wasn't fear that made Zane's chest tight. It was anger. Then there was a knock at the door. "Zane, we need to talk," came Jonah's voice. Zane opened the door, and there he was, standing in his business suit, his tie loose around his neck. His hair was damp from the rain, and his eyes looked serious. "Your wife sent me a message," Zane said before he could speak. "Ex-wife," he corrected quickly. "What message?" Zane showed him the phone. His face got darker as he read it. He clenched his jaw, trying to control his anger. "I'll handle this," he said quietly. "No," Zane said firmly. "I can fight my own battles, Mr. Maxwell." He stepped into her room without asking. After what almost happened today, lightning flashed outside, lighting up the room. Zane stepped back, keeping her distance, but her body wanted to close the gap. "What almost happened was a mistake," she said. "It's one we can't afford to make, especially now." "A mistake?" Jonah stepped closer. "Is that what you really believe? Or is that what you think you should believe?" "Does it matter?" Zane lifted her chin and stared at him. "We both know how this ends. I become just another scandal for the tabloids, another woman who couldn't resist the billionaire's charm. Your company loses confidence. The Morrison deal falls apart, and everything I've worked for crumbles." "You think this is just about me seeing you as a conquest?" Jonah said, his voice full of frustration. "I think," Zane said carefully, "that you're lonely and hurt, looking for comfort in familiar places, and I'm just convenient." Jonah moved so quickly she barely had time to react. Suddenly, he was right in front of her, one hand on the wall beside her head, his presence overwhelming. "Convenient?" he growled. "There's nothing convenient about lying awake at night thinking about you, sleeping down the hall. Nothing convenient about watching you run your empires, making everything look easy while driving me crazy with every little thing you do." Thunder crashed outside. Zane struggled to stay calm. "Jonah, please." 5 years, he said quietly. 5 years of watching you build walls around yourself, just like I have, telling myself you're off limits, untouchable. Then I find you in my bed, and suddenly every reason, every boundary seems meaningless. His hand gently touched her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. This time, no secretary interrupted. No phone rang, just the storm outside and the electricity between them. "Tell me you don't feel this," he challenged softly. "Tell me I'm imagining the way you shiver when I'm close, the way your breath catches when our eyes meet. Tell me, and I'll walk away." Zane's heart beat hard against her chest. "It's not that simple." His thumb traced her lower lip, sending a spark through her. "Just once, let go of control. Let yourself want something just because you want it." His words hit too close to home. Zane had always been careful, never taking risks. Growing up in Chicago with her single mom working 2 jobs, Zane had learned that success came with sacrifice and careful planning. "I can't lose everything I've built," she whispered, even though her body wanted to move closer to him. "Not even for you." Jonah's eyes shifted. There was understanding, respect, and something darker. "Who says you have to lose anything?" he said. Before she could respond, his phone buzzed. He muttered a curse as he looked at the message. "Vera and Elliot are making their move. They're calling an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning." Reality hit Zane like cold water. She straightened, her professional mask coming back on. "I'll start preparing the documents we need." "No," Jonah said, grabbing her wrist as she tried to move. "We're not done here." Zane met his gaze steadily. "Your company is under attack. That has to be our priority." His grip tightened a little. How long are we going to dance around this? Lightning flashed again, lighting up his eyes. Zane allowed herself to imagine letting go of her walls to take what she wanted. Then her phone beeped with another message from Vera. Choose wisely, darling. Some people are meant to serve, not lead. The words made her stronger. She gently pulled her wrist from Jonah's grip. We need to focus on saving your company. Everything else has to wait. Jonah looked like he wanted to protest, but years of working together had taught him how to read her signals. He stepped back. This isn't over, he said quietly. It never began, Zane replied, though it felt like the words were wrong. Now, about that board meeting. They spent the next few hours working, staying professional on the outside, but every touch, every glance between them was charged with feelings they couldn't ignore. As midnight came, Zane sat alone in her room, staring at the storm outside. Her fingers traced her lips where Jonah's thumb had been, remembering the heat of his body and the intensity in his eyes. Vera's words echoed in her mind. Some people are meant to serve, not lead. Zane looked at her reflection in the window. She saw the woman who fought for everything she had, who never let anyone else decide her limits. Tomorrow, she would help Jonah save his company. She would be brilliant, efficient, and professional, and she would show everyone, including herself, that she belonged at the top, strong and uncompromised. But in the quiet of the night, she whispered to herself what she could never say aloud. Sometimes the hardest part of being strong was denying the wishes of her heart. The next morning, in the Monroe Enterprises boardroom, the tension was thick in the air as the sun's first light came in through the windows. Zane stood at the entrance, watching the board members walk in. They all wore their expensive suits and masks, hiding what they were really thinking. Some supported Jonah, some had been swayed by Vera and Elliot. Zane looked flawless in a white power suit, her heels making her stand taller. If Vera wanted to play games, Zane was ready to show her how a real power player stayed in her lane. Quite the turnout, Reed Sutherland said with a knowing look as he walked past her. Ready for war? Before Zane could reply, the room changed as Vera entered. Her red dress hugged her body, and Elliot followed behind her, looking stressed. Vera locked eyes with Zane and smiled like a predator. Still playing secretary, darling? She sneered. Executive assistant to the CEO, Zane corrected smoothly. But you'd know that if you actually read any of the company documents, instead of just looking for ways to cheat. Vera's face twitched with anger, but she quickly covered it up. She leaned closer to Zane, whispering, Enjoy your little power trip while it lasts. After today, you'll learn what real influence looks like. The temperature in the room dropped. Then, Jonah entered. He wore a blue suit, looking powerful, and all eyes were on him. He glanced at Vera and Elliot, and then met Zane's eyes. A silent understanding passed between them. Ladies and gentlemen, Jonah said, his voice calm and strong, shall we begin? For the next 2 hours, it was like a corporate war. Vera and Elliot made their case, showing papers and testimonies, trying to prove their claims about the Morrison deal. But Zane saw how tense Jonah was, though he kept his cool. When it was his turn to speak, he stood up and said, Nice presentation, but it's based on lies. He nodded to Zane, who stepped forward. What you're about to see is the real story, she said confidently. On the screen, documents showed the real timeline of the Morrison deal, but it was the video that shocked everyone. This is security footage from 3 months ago, showing Mr. Maxwell already working on the deal, Zane said. Vera's face turned pale as her lies were revealed. Elliot tried to grab her hand, but she pulled away. Zane continued, showing text messages from Vera, proving she had planned to take credit for the deal during her divorce. The boardroom was buzzing with whispers. Vera jumped to her feet, furious, as everything she had tried to hide crumbled. You're spying on me, Mrs. Harrington? Jonah's voice cut through the loud noise like a sharp knife. We are all professionals here. Well, most of us. Elliot disagreed, but he didn't sound sure. This is a witch hunt, Zane spoke calmly. These documents have been checked by 3 separate experts. Their reports are in your packets, along with proof of your bad actions. The board members started to feel uncomfortable. They had been tricked by Vera and Elliot. Zane was showing everyone how they had tried to trick people. Reed Sutherland, an important board member, said, "I think we should get rid of this claim and look into anyone who has acted badly." The vote was fast and clear. Vera was left frozen as she saw her plan fall apart. She tried to get at Zane, shouting, "You think you're clever, but you're nothing but another woman in his bed." Jonah quickly stepped in between them, standing tall. "That's enough, Vera. Security will show you out." As the guards took Vera and Elliot away, Vera shouted, "This isn't over." Zane calmly replied, "Actually, it is. A restraining order has already been put in place. You should find a new hobby." Once the room was empty, Jonah and Zane stayed behind. The sun was shining brightly through the windows. Jonah said, "You did everything we needed." Zane replied, "The board is safe, the Morrison deal is secure, and your position is stronger than ever." Jonah looked at Zane and his voice softened. "You've been planning this for a long time, haven't you? You've been protecting the company, and you've been protecting me." Zane didn't look up from her tablet. "It's my job," she said quietly. Jonah stepped closer, his voice low. "No, it's more than that." Zane finally looked at him. "This isn't just business, it's personal." There was a long silence, but before they could say anything more, Reed Sutherland walked in. "Sorry to interrupt, but the reporters are waiting downstairs. We need to look united." Jonah and Zane walked to the elevator. They stood close together, both feeling like something had changed between them, but they didn't know what. When the elevator doors opened, they faced the cameras and reporters together. They looked like a team, but they both knew that something between them had shifted. Later that evening, Jonah was punching a bag in the gym, working off the stress of the day. The reporters had left, but he still felt frustrated. Zane walked in, and he knew it was her before she spoke. "The press is on your side, and the Morrison family has promised to stay with the deal," she said. Jonah stopped and wiped his face. "Thanks to you," he said, noticing how Zane was trying not to look at his sweaty chest. "I was just doing my job," she said, but they both knew it was more than that. Jonah grinned and stepped closer to her. "You've been watching my ex-wife for 2 years. Was that part of your job?" Zane stood tall. "You needed protection, even if you didn't know it." Jonah took another step closer, his voice lowering. "What I need is for you to stop pretending." Zane laughed bitterly. "The truth is, I watched her destroy you. I promised I would never let that happen again." Jonah softened. "So you decided to protect me?" Zane took a step back as he came closer. "You were too trusting, too willing to believe in people. I had to make sure it didn't happen again." Jonah stopped in front of her, his eyes intense. "And what about you? Are your feelings for me just business too?" The space between them felt charged with emotions. Zane whispered, "This isn't professional anymore." Jonah's hand touched her jaw gently, and his voice was deep. "Stop fighting it. Tell me what you want." Before Zane could answer, the door opened suddenly. Molly stood there, surprised. "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry," she said, backing away. "I was looking for Zane, but it looks like I'm interrupting." Zane stepped out from between Jonah and the wall. "It's fine. We were just discussing work." Molly looked at them both and raised an eyebrow. That didn't look like just work. Jonah quickly put on a shirt, trying to keep things professional again. Later, Zane was talking with Molly in the elevator. "You can't keep denying yourself happiness," Molly said softly. Zane sighed. "It's not about fear." "Then what is it?" Molly asked. Zane hesitated. "It's reality. One small mistake and people will start to question everything." Molly squeezed Zane's hand. "But love doesn't make you weak. Sometimes it makes you stronger." That night, Zane was in her room, looking at herself in the mirror. She had taken off her makeup and her hair was down. She didn't look like the confident woman she had been earlier that day. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Jonah. "Come to the pool. We need to finish our conversation." Zane's heart skipped a beat. Another message followed. "Please." She knew she should ignore it. But instead, she found herself walking to the pool where Jonah stood, looking out at the ocean. "This has to stop," she said softly, but her voice didn't sound sure. Jonah turned to her. "Then stop it. Tell me you don't feel what I feel, and I'll walk away." Zane couldn't say it. She stepped closer to him. Jonah closed the space between them. "Then stop fighting," he whispered. When they kissed, it felt like everything had changed. It was like they were both falling, but at the same time, they were both coming alive. But even as Zane kissed him back, she wondered, were they ready to change everything? The next morning, Zane felt lost in her thoughts. She couldn't stop thinking about the kiss. Her assistant's voice broke through her thoughts. "The Morrison team is here for the contract signing." Zane took a deep breath and went to Jonah's office. They acted like everything was normal, but neither of them could ignore the change that had happened between them. Jonah's voice was casual, but his eyes were intense. "We have a big deal to close today." Zane met his gaze, steady. "Everything else has to wait." Jonah moved closer. "I've waited 5 years for this. 5 years of wanting you." Zane's heart raced. "Jonah, please, not here." But Jonah didn't stop. "Maybe at my house, but or in the gym. Or even by the pool." Last night was perfect. Zane wanted to answer, but before she could, Jonah's phone rang. Zane stepped back, trying to put up her professional wall again. Zane's team was waiting, and she reminded him. They had just finished signing the contract, and everything had gone well, but Zane could feel Jonah looking at her all through the meeting. Every time their hands accidentally brushed when they passed papers, it made her skin tingle. Every time they looked at each other, there were feelings they didn't say out loud. After the lawyers left, Reed Sutherland stayed behind. He said, "Quite a change from yesterday, huh? But I noticed something interesting this morning." Zane felt her heart stop. "What do you mean?" she asked. Reed smiled but looked serious. "Just be careful. The board might have helped you with Vera, but office romances can be tricky." Zane's heart was racing. "I don't know what you mean," she said, but Reed gently put his hand on her shoulder. "I've known you both for years. Be careful." He left, and Zane stood alone, feeling nervous. She had worked hard to be seen as professional. One kiss, amazing as it was, couldn't ruin all of that, could it? The door opened behind her, and she didn't need to look to know it was Jonah. "Cancel your lunch plans," he said quietly. "I have a meeting with the PR team." "Cancel it?" she asked. "We're going somewhere." His voice was soft, but it made her listen. "Where?" she asked. "You'll see." 30 minutes later, Jonah was driving his fancy Aston Martin along the Pacific Coast Highway, leaving the city behind. Zane sat beside him, feeling excited and nervous. "This is kidnapping, you know," she joked. "Kidnapping needs unwilling people," he replied with a smile. His hand reached out and took hers. "Are you unwilling?" "You know I'm not," she said, feeling the sparks fly up her arm. They pulled up to a private house by the beach. Zane recognized it as one of Jonah's places, one she had helped him get years ago. "No phones," Jonah said. "No distractions, just us." Zane's heart raced. Inside, the house was all glass and light, with an ocean view. They sat in the living room, and Jonah said, "Talk to me. No titles, no business, just us." Zane was nervous. "I'm scared," she said. "Not of you, but of this. I've worked so hard to be professional, and I don't want people to think I got here by sleeping my way to the top." Jonah's voice was firm. "I know how smart and capable you are. It doesn't matter what others think." Zane stood up, pacing. "The world will see a powerful man and his younger assistant. They'll write that story themselves." Jonah grabbed her hand and pulled her back. "Let them write it. We'll show them a better story, by being 3 steps ahead of everyone else." He pulled her onto his lap, one hand in her hair. When he kissed her, it was full of passion, no holding back. Zane kissed him back, giving into the feeling she had kept inside for years. "Stay with me," he whispered against her lips. "Here today. No work. No phones. No outside world. Just us." Zane wanted to say no. She wanted to keep her professional life, but instead she kissed him harder, pouring all the years of longing into it. His hands held her tighter and they were lost in each other. They both knew, though, that the world was waiting. Vera, the board, and the press were all watching. Would they be able to keep their happiness, or would the world tear them apart? For now, they didn't care. In the peace of the beach house, they were just together. The sun set and Zane lay in bed, watching Jonah sleep beside her. Her phone was downstairs, probably buzzing with messages, but for the first time, she didn't care. She was at peace. Jonah woke up and reached for her. "You're thinking too loud," he mumbled, pulling her closer. "Someone has to," she said, but she didn't push him away. "No, they don't," he whispered, kissing her neck. But then there was a chime. The security system announced visitors. They froze. "Did you tell anyone about this place?" Zane asked. "No one," Jonah said. But then he checked the security feed. "Paparazzi," he growled. "They followed us." Zane felt panic rise in her chest. Her phone buzzed with messages. "TMZ is reporting about us," she read. "The board wants an emergency meeting." Then there was a message from someone unknown. "Like father, like son. He'll throw you away just like Harrison did." Zane felt cold. She remembered the story about Jonah's father, Harrison, and his affair with his assistant. It almost ruined the company. Was it happening again? Jonah came back upstairs, looking serious. "The paparazzi are leaving. I told them about trespassing laws." Zane showed him her phone. "Vera planned this, didn't she? She had us followed." Jonah's face got dark. "I won't let that happen. We haven't done anything wrong." Zane felt conflicted. "But I'm your assistant. This looks bad." Jonah stepped closer. "Stop pretending we don't want each other. This is more than just attraction." The sound of cameras clicking outside made her flinch. Jonah went downstairs to confront the photographers. Zane saw him through the window, looking strong and furious. She checked her phone. More messages. Then another one from Vera. "You're just like your father." Zane's heart sank. She feared the past was repeating itself. Jonah came back inside. "It's too late. We'll face this together," he said. He read Vera's message and was angry. "She planned this, but I don't care about the past. I'm not like my father." He pulled Zane into his arms. "I've loved you for years. I'm done pretending." Zane pulled back, looking at him. "You can't say things like that now, not when everything is a mess." Jonah kissed her gently. "I love you," he said. Zane felt her heart beat faster. "I love you too," she whispered. Jonah's kiss this time was different. It was full of meaning, not just passion. They knew they couldn't hide anymore. They had to face the chaos, the board, and the press. But as they drove back to the city, Zane felt calm. No matter what happened next, they had each other. They were ready to face whatever came their way. Their love was worth fighting for. At work the next morning, there was a buzz of excitement. People were talking about the scandal. Zane sat in her office, staring at her resignation letter. She remembered Jonah's reaction when she tried to give it to him. "No way," he had said. "We face this together." Now, as she prepared for the board meeting, she knew things would never be the same. Her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Mira. "Channel 4 is running a special report on office romance, the Maxwell legacy. Stay strong, girl." The sound of heels clicking on the floor made her look up. Vera stood in the doorway, looking fancy and serious in a red suit. "I tried to warn you," she said, looking at her nails, "but you just couldn't help yourself. Could you?" Zane stood up slowly, feeling strong. "Did you follow us yesterday, or did you pay someone to spy on us?" she asked. Vera smiled. "Does it matter? The result is the same. By noon, you'll be the new warning story about assistants who dream too big, right? And Jonah, he'll realize some things are just in the blood." Zane's voice was calm but strong. "You don't really know him, do you? He's nothing like his father. She walked around her desk, getting closer to Vera. That's why you lost him, not because of Elliot, but because you never really saw who he is. Vera raised her eyebrows. And you think you do? She said. Zane nodded. I know I do. And I'm nothing like the woman Harrison Maxwell threw away. Vera turned to leave, but paused. The board meeting will be interesting. I heard Harrison himself is coming. The news hit Zane hard. Harrison Maxwell, the founder of the company, hadn't been in the building for 5 years. His return could only mean trouble. She found Jonah in the gym, punching a punching bag. His punches were loud, showing his anger. Your dad's coming, she said. Jonah didn't stop. I know, he said. Reed called. We can still beat this. Zane moved closer, ignoring the sweat on his skin. What if I resign? She asked. He stopped the bag. No. Then what's the plan? She asked. How do we fight this? Jonah looked at her, and the love in his eyes took her breath away. We tell the truth, all of it, he said. The truth about us, about Vera's tricks, about how you've been the real reason Maxwell Enterprises is doing well. You've been the one behind it all. And about how I've loved you from the first day you told me I was wrong in that merger meeting. Zane smiled. I thought you'd fire me for that. I almost did, Jonah said, grinning. But then I realized you were right. You've always been right. They went to the boardroom. Everyone was there, and at the far end of the table sat Harrison Maxwell, looking strong and serious as always. Jonah took his seat at the head of the table. Before we start, Jonah said, his voice calm and clear, I have something to say. What you see on the screens is the real truth about Maxwell Enterprises. Everything good that's happened in the last 5 years happened because of one person. Mrs. Clark isn't just my assistant. She's the one who made all our big decisions and ideas happen. She's the one I love. The room was silent. Reed spoke up. The problem isn't about Mrs. Clark being smart. It's about how it looks, especially with the past. Jonah was calm. You mean my father's affair? Let's talk about that. For 25 years, this company has been too scared of looking bad, and because of that fear, we let people like Vera hurt us. Enough, Harrison said, his voice strong. You're letting your emotions affect your judgment. No, Dad, Jonah said softly. I see things clearly now. You let fear make you lose the woman you loved. I won't make the same mistake. Jonah turned to Zane and stood beside her. I'm not asking the board for permission. I'm telling you how it's going to be. Zane and I are together, and I'm giving her the job she should have had a long time ago, Chief Strategy Officer. Harrison frowned, but then he smiled. If you all disagree, I will quit. I'll give away my shares, my contacts, and my team. The room was silent for a long moment. Finally, Reed raised his hand. I move to create the position of Chief Strategy Officer starting right now. One by one, the board members agreed. Even Harrison nodded. You're not like your old man, he said, his voice proud. As the meeting ended, Zane thought about what Vera had said earlier. Like mother, like son. Vera had been right about some things, but she was wrong about how things would turn out. Some patterns were meant to be broken. Jonah pulled Zane into his arms, ignoring the people watching through the glass walls. Help me run this company the right way, Chief Strategy Officer, he said. Zane smiled. I thought I already was. Outside, reporters were shouting questions, but none of it mattered now. They had chosen love over fear, truth over lies, and each other over everything else. That was the only thing that really mattered. 6 months later, it was time for the Maxwell Enterprises Christmas Gala. The ballroom sparkled with thousands of tiny lights, and Zane stood in the center, glowing in a gold dress. Jonah watched her with pride. She had gone from behind the scenes to being a public star. Forbes had named her one of the year's 40 under 40, recognizing all the amazing things she'd done for Maxwell Enterprises. She's something else, isn't she? Harrison said, standing next to Jonah. She's everything, Jonah replied, watching Zane charm the guests. Harrison smiled. Your mother called yesterday. She's happy for you. She says Zane reminds her of herself before I made mistakes. Jonah looked at his father. You can't change the past, Dad. I know, Harrison said with a small smile. But you learned from it. You chose love over fear. I'm proud of you. Just then, there was a commotion near the door. Vera had shown up, even though she wasn't invited. She wore red, just like always. But she looked different. Her divorce from Elliot had been all over the news. Zane stood by Jonah, her hand in his. Should we have security remove her? She asked. No, Jonah said, wrapping his arms around her. Let her see what she lost. Vera looked around the room, staring at Jonah and Zane standing together. Her eyes fell on Harrison, standing next to them like a family. Without a word, Vera turned and left. Harrison raised his glass. Here's to closing old chapters. Molly appeared with champagne and a playful smile, and starting new ones. Or are we not supposed to talk about the velvet box in Jonah's jacket? Zane gasped, but Jonah just laughed. Actually, he said, I had planned something more private, but maybe it's fitting to do it here, where it all started. Everyone grew quiet as Jonah knelt down. 5 years ago, he said, his voice clear, you walked into my office and told me my plan was all wrong. You were smart, brave, and didn't care about hurting my feelings. I knew then you were special, but I didn't know how much you would change my life. He opened the velvet box, showing a beautiful diamond ring. You've been running my world for years, Zane Clark. Now I'm asking you to run it officially as my partner in everything. Marry me. Zane's eyes filled with tears as she looked down at the man she had loved for so long. This was going to cause a big news story, and Zane knew it. Jonah's smile was so bright as he said, I'm done hiding how much I love you. Zane whispered, yes, and then said it louder, yes. The room filled with claps and cheers as Jonah put the ring on her finger. Zane was already typing on her phone to share the news. Harrison, who was in the room, quietly wiped his eyes. That night, they were on the balcony of Jonah's house in Malibu, looking at the ocean below. The stars were shining above them. Jonah asked, are you having second thoughts? He noticed that Zane was thinking a lot. Zane shook her head. Never, she said. She smiled, looking at her ring. I was just thinking about the first night when you found me in your bed. Did you ever think we would be here? Jonah smiled too. I hoped. Even then, part of me knew you were the one. I just had to get past my own fears. Zane looked up at him and said, me too. They kissed, and then Zane added, but I never thought we would be all over the tabloids. Jonah laughed. I didn't think so either. Zane smirked. I didn't plan to kiss you all over your office after that meeting either. Jonah pulled her closer. It was your idea, not mine. Zane played with his bow tie. Maybe we should go back to where it all started, with you finding me in your bed again. Jonah looked at her with desire. I love the way your mind works. They went to the bedroom, the same one where their story began. There was no fear now, no worry. They knew they loved each other deeply. I love you, Jonah whispered as he kissed her. Every part of you. I love you too, Zane said, kissing him back. Outside, the city lights sparkled. Inside, the two of them held each other close, knowing they had faced many challenges together and had come through stronger. They learned that love is not a weakness, but a strength, and a real partnership means helping each other grow. A year later, Zane was in her office looking at a business report. On the desk, there was a newspaper with a headline about her. It said she and Jonah were a power couple who changed the way business worked. Zane smiled, but then Molly, her friend, knocked on the door. The New York Times wants another interview. They want to talk about how you and Jonah are breaking all the rules of business. Zane said, tell them to talk to our PR team. I'm done being their poster girl for business romance. Molly sat down. You love it, especially since that article you wrote for Women in Business went viral. You're a legend now. Before Zane could answer, Jonah came into the room, his face lighting up when he saw her. He smiled and asked, Ready for lunch? He looked at Molly and said, "You can join us. We'll let you third wheel again." Molly laughed. "Someone has to run the company while you two stare at each other." As they went down in the elevator, Jonah held Zane's hand. "How are my girls today?" Zane smiled. "We're good, though your daughter is already obsessed with early meetings. She was doing flips during the board call." Jonah smiled proudly. "That's my girl, already learning the business." They walked out into the lobby where Harrison, who had become like family, was waiting for them. Everyone smiled as they saw the three generations of Maxwell Enterprises. Zane felt proud. Life wasn't perfect, but they had built something special together. A love story that didn't need sacrifice and a company based on teamwork instead of power. Zane looked at her reflection in the lobby's shiny walls. She was now a powerful executive, had a beloved wife, and a soon-to-be mom. She knew that sometimes the biggest risks in life lead to the biggest rewards. She had taken a chance on love, and it had made everything better, both in her personal life and her career. Thanks for watching. If you liked the story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Check out our other videos too. See you in the next one.